Okay, so we're going to start with the next presentation, and believe me that one of the pleasures of this life in the legal standpoint is to read what Professor Taruffo has written. Another pleasure is to have the opportunity to introduce him. I have read him for many years when I started to work in the field some 25 years ago, and I started reading Taruffo's articles about collective processes. And I remember starting reading him in the beginning of the 90s, but the truth is that every time that I started a research on a certain subject, there was always an article by Professor Taruffo illustrating our purpose, and his contributions are many. We can, of course, think of the procedural and ex-procedural position, or the book about the evidence of facts, translated by Jordi and articles of such as collateral stock, for instance. And this way we know that he is really an academic of law, and we realize that he is one of the very few Europeans that have managed to receive an invitation to teach in the States, and not only to go to their libraries, which is what happens more often, but really to teach to the people in that country, in Cornell University in particular. And we keep on diving on his biography, and we can think whether he has written something about artificial intelligence. And yes, indeed, I read an article he wrote in the 90s in which he talked about artificial intelligence. And then, of course, the Semplice Verità, his last work, which is a very holistic approach of his work. So it's a pleasure for us to have him here about inferences in judicial decisions about facts. So without further ado, we give him the floor.
Muchas gracias, Jordi, por esta.
Thank you very much, Jordi, for this very kind presentation. Two premises. The first is that the text of my presentation is in English, but because I'm here in Girona, I will try to speak in my very personal interpretation of Spanish, and I apologize from the very beginning for all the mistakes that I will make. Second premise, I will try seriously to stick to time, because at this time of the afternoon or evening, I don't think we have enough energy to talk for hours. So this to say that I will try to be very brief about things that would deserve a much more detailed analysis, but I don't have time for that. So I just make reference to the written text for everything that I won't be able to explain. So the points of my talk are mainly two. The second will try to analyze logical aspects of inferences that should be made in order to build the assessment of facts, in order to draw justified epistemic solution. The first part has to do with premises that determine the perspective that I use in order to talk about the logic of the probatory assessment. Premises that may not be obvious, even they might seem obvious. And I'm not going to analyze everything, but I have some examples of these. For instance, a very important problem is how we understand, how we define the aim of the procedure. And there are many theories. And if we take into account the adversarial theory, the pure adversarial theory, that the idea is to solve a conflict among two people in trying to find what happened to the defendant without taking into account the final decision, because I'm making reference to what was said many years ago, that the procedure is like a sport competition, and the main aim of a sport competition is to know who is the winner, who the winner is. So there is no legal decision as such at the end of a football match or any other kind of competition. So if we start with this idea that is still very popular among modern adversarialists or guarantists, my talk could end here, because if we do not take into account anything, I mean, if we do not consider anything, such as the decision that determines the conclusion of the conflict, then why should we talk about evidence? Why should we talk about truth? Why should we talk about all the things that we're talking about? So I choose another theory, which is classic, a classic one in the doctrine of, in the systems of civil law of the European kind, when we say that if the aim of the procedure is to solve a conflict, but not in any way, not just tossing a coin or seeing how many goals have been made, the judge has to make a decision which is correct from the judiciary or the legal point of view, which is the consequence of the correct application of law. In all modern systems with the principle of legality, it's obvious that the aim of the procedure is to have a just and fair sentence that solves the conflict between the parties. But then, what does correctly applying law means? Law philosophers say that every rule has a conditional structure. That is, it has two factors, a condition and a consequence. The condition is a factual one, it's not a legal one, because it determines the kind of facts in which the consequence is applied. That can be obvious. Every time that someone causes the death of someone else, we apply the consequence of that fact. Therefore, if and only if there is a condition, I mean, if Peter killed Pablo, then only this criminal law about homicide is applied, because if the factual premise does not exist, if it's not true that Peter killed Pablo, then we cannot apply that rule. If we apply it, then we're condemning an innocent, convicting an innocent. And this can be obvious, but not very much, because if we accept a perspective of this kind, this means that establishing the truth of the specific fact that has to be linked to the kind of fact that is within the rule. I mean, establishing the truth in these kind of facts is a necessary condition to make a decision in order to properly apply the norm, the rule in the particular case. If there is no premise, or this premise, then the rule that we are mentioning is not properly applied. Therefore, that's my way of thinking. And one of the consequences is that we need to consider the search for factual truth in the particular case as one among the necessary aims of the procedure, civil or criminal, etc. And I'm being very general here. But saying that the decision has to be founded or grounded on the truth of the facts means that this truth has to be a description of the pertinent relevant facts. And I'm talking about the rule of law that is applied. And this decision has to be specific and has to be justified in an analytic way. And here we find another problem, because we find the theory of the holistic evaluation of the evidence that is used, especially in the States, when they try to describe how the jury decides, and saying that the jury decides just at once about all that they have been listening concerning the evidence presented. And this is typical from juries. But I don't know whether these analyses that have been shown in literature in the last decades really show things as they are. I have my doubts, reasonable doubts. But let's admit that the jury decides in this holistic way and unitary way. This cannot be a general rule, because, in my opinion, adopting a rational idea of the evidence assessment, I think that rationality in this assessment is analytic. I mean, the probatory value has to be determined from an analytic point of view, thanks to every document, every witness, and at the very end there can be a complete assessment from this analytic point of view. And this is a very complex problem, but to me, talking about an holistic assessment means talking about a rational decision, because in an holistic procedure there is nothing rational. In fact, there is something that to me is much more close to the intimate conviction, and I'm a rationalist, and therefore when I listen things about moral certainties, objective intuitions, etc. I just take a step backwards and say, this is not for me. And of course we can debate about all these. I mean, of course, the intimate convictions keeps on being the main point in the French criminal procedure, even though we could talk a lot about this, of course, as my friend John says. So rationalism on the one hand, and a certain trend to prefer the analytical justification of every element of evidence. And then there is another premise. The maximization, a rational evaluation of the evidence mean that every possible evidence is assessed from the analytical standpoint, because if there are evidence that are left aside, this means that a part of this rational ground lacks or is missing in this assessment. Another aspect, relevant aspect, another premise, is that if we talk about discovering the truth of the facts, what are we really talking about? Which kind of truth are we talking about? Let's talk I don't know, we could start maybe with Greek philosophy, what truth is. I don't think we need to do that. I'm not able to do that kind of analysis. So we have another premise that we can talk about and we can debate about, because it can be controversial. But when we talk about truth, procedural truth, and the search for truth, then we talk about truth as a correspondence, and the origin is in Aristotle. But we also talk about the truth as a correspondence for the description of a fact towards the reality of the fact about which we talk. And this is also dealt with in the philosophy along recent years. There are several theories that say that is the coherence of a description of or a discourse the one that determines the truth of the speech. So there is a set of philosophical currents which are very popular, and of course between this idea of coherence and the idea of correspondence of truth there is nothing in common. Why? Because a description can be very coherent and be false at the same time. A good novel can be very coherent from the narration point of view, and it does not intend to be truthful. And we have, for instance, an essay by Umberto Eco, who, apart from being a very well-known writer, he worked and dealt with analysis of the logic and language. And in one of his very last conferences, Eco states in a very clear way a distinction, talking about the truth of narrations. And he says a narration can be truthful in its inner self, a kind of truth within the narration, or it can be truthful outside. That means a truth of the narration. And he says, for instance, in Sherlock Holmes novels, it's true that Sherlock Holmes lives in a street in London, despite the fact that this street in London has never existed. But within the narration, Sherlock Holmes' narration, it's true that he lives in that street. And in Tolstoy narration, it's true that Anna Karenina was on a train, despite the fact that Anna Karenina never existed. So if we talk about the truth within the narration, these are truths. The thing that is said in a novel can be truth if the narration is properly done, if it's coherent within its context. Another thing is if a narration is truthful in reality, I mean outside the text. Of course, that's another kind of truth. Sherlock Holmes novels are not a truth outside the narration because there's nothing from reality there. So this is important. This is important because whether, as some theories state, the problem in legal terms is that we take a narration or a good narration or a bad narration. This means to adopt something. I mean, we're not talking about truth, of something being true or false. But from my standpoint, I cannot leave the question of the truth for what I've just explained, or adopt an idea of the truth which is inner to the narration. The narration is truthful if it's good. I mean, if it's a good description of a fact. But here there is a basic difference. What are we talking about? We are talking about the text in itself, maybe following the reader. He says that from a text there is a context, and from the context there is something, but we are always talking about text and never about the world. Or are we talking about the world as such? That's a really basic difference. Adopting an idea of the truth not as a narrative coherence, or not only as a narrative coherence, and adopting, on the contrary, an idea of the truth as a correspondence to reality. That's an option or basic distinction. And accepting the truth means accepting a metaphysic hypothesis, which is very important, that is the existence of the outer world. And many philosophers deny this in one way or another. Irrationalist philosophies or idealist philosophies, many of them deny or doubt that a reality outside the subject exists. But if I doubt the existence of reality, then I cannot accept an idea of the reality as a correspondence to the reality that does not exist. And this is a very important problem. Of course, I cannot analyze this enough right now, but there is something given when, for instance, when Alfred Tarski, the Polish philosopher that in the 30s wrote many things about the criteria of truth, and there are many interpretations about his writings. This would be another subject for us. But there are some interpretations by Tarski that say, Tarski says that, he was a correspondentist. He accepted in a more or less explicit way a certain idea of the truth as a correspondence, especially when he says that the snow is white, between inverted commas. But this is truth only if snow is white. If it's only if the reality of the snow determines the truth of the snow. I think that we are especially talking about this idea of the truth. I mean, the procedure is not a kind of literary competition or contest in order to, give an award to a certain novel. The procedure deals with reality. Law applied in the procedure is applied in the reality of the world, not to a speech, not to a novel. And there are many examples of this. Another example that I can mention here, because I think it's important, we can find it in the Broker novel by John Grisham, a novel that talks about a story that takes place in Bologna. And in a page of the novel, Grisham says that in Bologna, in a certain street, there is a certain building, a building of the law faculty of the city. And this statement is true in reality, because it's true that in that street in Bologna there is that building exists. But in another sentence he says, in that building, the offices of the professors. I mean, we have the offices of the professors, but that's false. It's not true. It could be, but it's not the case. So in 4 lines, there is a true in the description, that corresponds to reality and a true in the description, because in the context of the novel, it said that there was an office of a professor. So reading any kind of text, such as a novel in this case, if we make an analysis of this kind about the two ideas of the truth, internal and external, allows us to interpret in a proper way what the text says. Another point. There are several theories about the decision which is related to the facts, and I'm leaving aside the idea of the true or the truth. There are several ideas, and one of them says that the aim of the procedure or the judge, when he takes a decision, he or she takes a decision, is to find or to formulate an inference to the inference of the best explanation. And he says that among the different explanations of the fact that can be known or that is part of the procedure by the parties or by the judge, the best way to reach a conclusion, a conclusive decision, is to see which is the best explanation of the facts that are dealt with. At first sight, an idea of this kind seems reasonable. I mean, if we have 2 or 3 or 4 points, this can be possible. We can have ideas that have been built by the parties, by the witnesses, by the judge, and concerning those facts, a good decision would be to take the best possible explanation. I mean, this seems reasonable. However, I have some doubts about this point, because first, if we need to understand the criteria in order to choose the best possible explanation, then there are no clear criteria. I mean, things are very generic and very ambiguous or large. For instance, we talk about the best possible explanation, but we say that this best explanation has to have coherent, has to have common sense, be reasonable, connect with the context, the facts and the evidence. But these are not really big standard, just words, words with a certain meaning, but we do not get anywhere. And it's also a theory that to me is an holistic theory, because we are not talking about the analytic control, about the probabilistic situation, but just about a description of the facts. Furthermore, we talk about narrative coherence. We are not talking about the truth or the false aspect of the fact. So we are talking about text and not correspondence of a text with an external reality. And the best possible explanation can have a very low level of probatory confirmation, very few evidence. And then what does this mean? That we think it's a truth, even though there is no probatory confirmation because the other possibilities are worse? I don't know. We have this set of problems. I'm not going to insist upon the other theory, rational theory, between inverted commas, about the probatory assessment, because that's the theory that we have been already talking about, quantitative probability, the bias, etc. So I'm not going to do any criticism to the bias theory. my criticism is towards the applicability of this theory in a legal context. The bias theory says something which is quite simple from a conceptual point of view. If we have a priori or a certain probability, and within the context we receive a new evidence, new information, applying this theory, we reach the probability afterwards. That is the result of this new information. Okay, fine. But in almost all legal cases, we do not have a priori a probability, and if we do not have that possibility, how can we assess anything? We cannot. And then there is the suggestion that says if we do not have a certain percentage, then we invent, we make it out. And well, we have just an experience or a generalization, but we need to apply a percentage, and then what do we say? We have this experience that says normally this happens. Let's imagine that usually means 90% of the cases. And then here we have a percentage, and we can apply this bias theorem or theory, and then we fall into something completely false. We are in a lie, in a fallacy. We are quantifying something that cannot be quantified, really. Why? Why am I saying 90%? Why not 85 or 83? I mean, it's arbitrary. So the premise of the application of calculus is really arbitrary. And there are other reasons not to consider this, but if you allow me one more minute to just talk about the personal experience, I said exactly the same things in 1992. That is in the original version of my book, the Proof of Facts, the Evidence of Facts, and talking about the theoric of probability. He said, I have read your criticism, I think you're right. I said, okay, great, it's great to have this reason, but we are working on this problem, and in 10 years time we will be able to answer to your criticism. And I said, okay, when in 10 years time, just call me, because I'm interested to know how my criticisms have been solved. So 10 years after, 10 years later, silence. 10 years even later, silence. And then we are in 2012, from 1992 to 2012, and in 2014, a book is published by this probability theoretician, and he tries to reformulate the theory from bias of this probability applied to the evidence in a very specific way. Unfortunately, there is no answer to the criticism. I've read the 500 pages with all the mathematical formula, trying to find the solution to the problem that we almost never have this probability a priori. So there we have some reasons to leave aside this theory, despite the books and the essays that have been published about this theory. Therefore, and I'm here reaching my last point because I'm trying to stick to time, so leaving aside these and these and these and this idea that this does not work and so on and so forth, that talking about inferences, probatory inferences, I understand that one of the possible applications of the idea of the logic probability and not mathematical probability the logic probability does not work with data or calculations, but with logic connections between enunciations or statements. Syllogism, for instance, for more than 2000 years, syllogism has been the first model of logic inference, that is, a very logic link between premises and consequences. So this is my opinion about the correct direction in order to analyze what can really be a rational assessment of the evidence. That is, we need to work with logic tools, taking into account that from the modern standpoint there is not just one single logic, and each logic can be a good tool in order to solve different problems depending on the nature of the problem. So here we have several possibilities. Traditional example was a formal analysis of the inferences, complex inferences in the context of evidence assessment. Is it valid? Is it not valid? This has been very criticized, but I think it could be possible. And my idea, it's not my original idea, because Daniel Gonzalez, for instance, published a very good essay along the same lines. But the idea is to use a logic formula that has been proposed by Stephen Tolman in his work of 58 about argumentation. He's an American philosopher, and it's a very easy formula with 3 different factors. If one is not an expert in formal logic, can use also this scheme. And what's the scheme really? The scheme is very easy. We have a hypothesis, and the problem is to establish whether this hypothesis is true or false, whether it has a good foundation or not. So first of all, we need to state the hypothesis, and this can be a kind of abductive operation according to the logic of production. Then second point, among the probatory information, we need to choose one information or more, one evidence or more that can be linked to the hypothesis. And then we can see whether those information justify or not that the hypothesis is accepted as true or justified. For instance, I need to establish whether Socrates is mortal or not. And choosing the information, I find out that he is a man, so I have this information. Socrates is a man, and I have a hypothesis. Socrates is or not, he's not mortal. Is that enough? No, this is not enough, because the information about the man does not tell me anything about Socrates. So I need a third element, which is the basic factor of the inference. That is an inference rule, a backup, a kind of support. In the specific case, the inference rule is every man is mortal. And this rule that justifies the conclusion that then, yes, is justified. It's justified to say that Socrates is mortal because he's a man. So we have 3 factors: a hypothesis, an information about this hypothesis, and a rule that justifies the link, the connection that starts with an information and finishes with the hypothesis that is being justified. And within this scheme, it's clear that the most important aspect is the rule of inference. In the case of Socrates, this is a general rule, and therefore the conclusion is justified as true and absolute, as in the classic centuries. And if we have a rule of nature or a generalization that allows us to connect an evidence with a conclusion, then we are in the nomologic deductive model, that is an deductive inference founded or grounded on a homologic rule or deductive rule. If things are as such, despite of using the inference rules that works worse. But the problem starts being a little bit more complex when we do not have a general rule, but we have a statistical percentage. I can say, for instance, that in 90% of the cases, men are mortal. What's the conclusion? That there is a 90% of probability that Socrates is mortal? No, because either he's mortal, either he's not. So things get a little bit more complex when we state the value of an inference of this kind. And it's even more complex if we do not have a statistic percentage, if we do not have a rule of experience or a generalization that does not say anything in particular about the connection between two facts. But within these limits, and I'm getting to the point, I'm getting to the end of my presentation with these limits, and I say it in my written presentation, this conceptual presentation of this inference allows us to analyze, by Tolman, allows us to analyze probative contexts, which are very complex. Two very quick examples so that we can understand the point. This formula, evidence, rule of inference, conclusion about a hypothesis, can be used in order to build a linear sequence of inferences, that is, a set of inferences that end up in the most interesting hypothesis, but that take into account different factors in a linear way. That is, an evidence can be the result of another previous inference, and the evidence of the previous can be the result of another previous inference. So that's the linear chain. And the only basic rule is that the strength of the conclusion equals the strength of the weakest inference. And in that line chain of inferences, there is a step that does not work. The whole of the inference just fails. And with the same technique, there are more examples in my written text, but we can also analyze the set of evidence on the same conclusions. Let's imagine that we have three different hints or clues, and from every one of them we can draw a conclusion, the same conclusion. We have the classic problem, and every hint is interpreted with the rule of inference. And we have three signs or clues or evidences that really coincide, and that's good for our conclusion. But the classic problem for ages and ages has been when each one of the three indications or clues is not enough to justify the conclusion. Then what do we do? What do we do in that case? In treatises about indications or clues of the 16th or 17th century, there are plenty of examples that have been analyzed. And to finish now in 2 minutes, I would like to make reference to something that happened to me personally. And I will talk to you about that case. It's a case related to Berlusconi. Berlusconi, during the 80s, he buys the most important publishing house in Italy, and in the contract there are problems because there is an arbitration clause, and the arbitration clause give the reason to the other party. So he appeals, Berlusconi appeals, and he tries to buy the judge, to pay the judge to, to be sure that he will be given the reason. But of course, then there is a criminal case because of the corruption of the judge. And Berlusconi says, "Oh, I didn't know anything. It's my lawyer who took care about everything." So he is considered, the lawyer is considered guilty of corruption. Where is the evidence for corruption? So there was a set of clues or indications about that corruption, and the criminal judge says there is enough evidence of corruption, so 60 years of jail. Appeal, and then the new court says, okay, yes, we have this clues, but this first clue is not enough to prove corruption. The second sign or indication, second evidence is not enough, the third is not enough, the fourth is not enough, so there is no evidence at all. Full stop. And then time passes by, and the lawyer of the other party calls me and says, we have here the risk of civil prescription of damages, so what do? Well, we are going to sue them for damages, but the evidence that we have are exactly the same that were in the criminal case. And the second instance court saying that this evidence was not enough. So I have to make a report saying that the right way to assess this is to take into account the whole set of clues or evidences. So what happened? The civil court accepts, and Berlusconi is condemned to paying 700 million euros. And the same happens with the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. And why am I mentioning this example? Not to talk about my personal experience, but to explain how inferences are built. These are not just abstract issues, fantasy, and no. These things can have a very particular context. And money is involved. So applying one formula or applying another formula can change everything. So the first formula was not proving corruption, but the second one did justify the conclusion. And all in all, the Supreme Court, the criminal court, really followed and agreed with my interpretation. So I invite you to read the text of my presentation, in which you will see the detail of different examples with very detailed analysis of the inferences. But I would like to finish my point saying that this kind of analysis can have two functions. One which would be heuristic, that is to build a rational decision about the evidences that we have. And then the other is justificative, because analyzing this probative evidence, we can motivate a decision about the facts. Thank you.
Bien, muchas gracias por tu ponencia.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So many things have been mentioned, even this financial aspect to great interest of the room. But there's also the cascade evidence, the high probability, and so many things. And I'm sure that there will be questions all over. There's one first question over there.
Ahí, sí. Efectivamente.
Yes.
Bueno, muchas gracias por...
Well, thank you. Such an instructive presentation and so encouraging in a way. And, well, of all the things I was thinking about, I'm going to choose only one because there were so many. You kind of said that the attribution of value to every evidence comes from atomic analysis. And once we attribute this value remains constant and invariable. That is, we can sometimes add the value attributed to evidence and the value attributed to another item of evidence, like a polygonal vector addition, but every vector has its value and every problem has its value as well that remains constant. So my question is just, demanding holism, really. I'm requesting a little niche for being holistic, and it's simple. My question is, what happens then with the overlapping evidence? What happens with the mutually dependent, reciprocally conditioned evidence in such a way that the value that we attribute at the beginning to one type of evidence is modified as soon as we analyze the value of evidence number 2 or evidence number 3, in such a way that we can even affirm or state that the resulting value of the analysis is ephemeral because it depends on what we attribute to the others. I think this is something implicit. It's what Bentham called self-corroborative reasoning. It's something more explicit. I don't know, Hartman, for example, talks about the snowball effects or cascade effects, and he also made it clear. If I understood correctly out of this morning's presentation of Professor Allen, especially when he talked about the visibility of the evidence, well, but in this case, furthermore, quite often we can't merge evidence together or consider it as a set because we talk of evidence that is too heterogeneous and it responds to different warrants. So then if one has to give an example, well then, I don't know, in the Spanish legislation, the value of the documentary evidence with a notary was legally stipulated and defined, and it was maximum furthermore. So any public document signed with a notary had the maximum value. But we all know, don't we now, that many public documents with a notary have been fabricated just to elude the payment of tax. So how has this problem been overcome? Well, thanks to rather kind of not so clear jurisprudential practice in which the evidence was taken as a whole lot, as a batch, and, with all the probative material, and however much the analysis of the legislator says that the value of this evidence is huge, and there are reasons to think it is huge, because, of course, it's a kind of public document with many warrants, but, in fact, we are not going to take any notice. We're going to ignore it. So my question is very simple. Don't you think that it would be necessary to open the door in a certain way? And, of course, it's not for me at all to say how much we should open it, but opening it to a holistic analysis and the joint assessment of the evidence? Thank you. About this, just one comment, one remark. I don't think of the possibility of valued evidence, because if there is a legal link in the positive consideration of evidence as public document, but, for example, it would be necessary to consider if the public document is authentic or not. Of course, that's another kind of assessment that is not determined by law, but in a specific case. But never mind, let's forget about that. In the case of the complexity of many types of evidence, it's the normal case. It's what tends to happen. And that's the reason why I say that we have to analyze the construction of the inferences that connect in a specific manner, that connect one type of evidence to others. And very often there is contrary evidence. One witness says yes, another witness says no, and one has to see what the prevailing hypothesis is here. My skepticism, moderate skepticism, we could say, about this holistic assessment comes in instances in which we are not talking about considering all the evidence we have that can be more or less numerous or more or less consistent, but rather we are told, no, this is an intuition about everything that went on, everything that happened. It's an intuition in the descriptions we have, especially in the cases of the North American juries. If it's intuition, well, there's practically nothing rational there. And that's, well, then the jury doesn't really explain the verdict and doesn't give any more explanation. My friend Miriam Damashka wrote that the jury trials is the last ordalic way of solving conflicts, with the only difference that in the jury there's the people's speaking, whereas in the old orderlies it was God's voice. But of course, this means that we are out of rational control of the justificative basis of the decision. One can accept this system. Before they used to accept God's judgment, well, why not accept it? It's a cultural issue, really, a political issue, maybe. My criticism is only in the sense that if you maintain this holistic framework, as it is understood, and that's the way I see it, well, then we're talking about something that has practically nothing at all to do with a rational analysis of the informations that come through the evidence. If we're talking about pure intuition or moral certainty, well, fine. Then we're just out, at least that's my opinion. We are completely out of a rigorously rational standpoint about the assessment of evidence as a tool in the quest for truth on the facts of the case. Naturally, I'm not going to talk more about truth, that as we know is inferential, relative, not absolute, and so on and so forth, because I wouldn't have time to go into this. But this, the way I see it, is one of the differences, because one thing is to say to the, not to the jury, to the judge, you have to analyze each and every one of the indications or hints and clues that you have, each one of the evidences, that is, on each one, and state whether it is relevant, pertinent, not relevant, whether it is giving reliable information or not giving reliable information. And only after having analyzed all possible evidence, then the judge says, well, okay, here I have a set or a probative weight, as it is called, that allows me to conclude in an inductive or probabilistic way, so, but not in the mathematician's sense. It allows me to conclude that there are more reasons to consider the fact in itself true and proven, and instead of not. But I repeat and I insist, not in terms of looking for that narratively more interesting explanation, but rather considering the problem of truth as a correspondence of the reality of the facts that hypothetically took place in the world, not only in the texts, okay? That is what we work on during the process, during the trial. Thank you. Dr. Allen.
Michele, it's always a great pleasure to see you. And I don't know whether you do this just to tease me, but every time I'm in the audience, you invoke this stupid judge from 200 years ago who analogized the adversary process to a fox hunt. And I thought we had come to agreement after many conversations that it's pretty obvious that no modern market economy could possibly function without a legal system that makes a promise and keeps it of relatively efficient and accurate fact-finding. So it just seems, you know, this fox hunt stuff is just silly. But my main point is this: in the contribution of your paper is to put a third explanation on the table of the nature of juridical proof. You reject probabilism, which, of course, I wholeheartedly agree with. You refer to inference as the best explanation, but that's a philosophical foundation for relative plausibility. You reject that, and you put a third one on the table, which is what you call this analytical approach. Now, I think you reject relative plausibility too quickly because of the following reason. I'm going to formalize the question that was just asked to you. To do what you're talking about, you have to look at all the combinations of evidence, as you point out in your paper, the way they can interact and so on. If there are just 10 pieces of evidence, just 10, which is a 2-minute testimony, there are 10 factorial combinations of those pieces of evidence. 10 factorial is about 3.6 million. So you'd have to be doing 3.6 million Toulmin diagrams to, in your somewhat heroic words, look at every single possibility, every way the evidence can interact, and so on. If you get to just 30 pieces of evidence, now you have 32 factorial combinations, and 30 factorial combinations is 2.6 times 10 to the 19th power. That's 26 followed by 18 zeros. This can't be done. Now, why do I say you've rejected relative plausibility? The significance of relative plausibility is not this holism stuff. I don't know where you and others in this last few days have equated relative plausibility with holism. It doesn't take a position on holism versus atomism. That's not really the point. The advantage, one of the advantages of it, not advantages, but actually one of the principles, is it looks to the ways in which complexity is tamed. Mm-hmm. And the parties are not ambiguity generators. The parties are ambiguity discarders. The way in which something like relative plausibility helps you is you have to figure out some way to get away from the 3.5 million or 2.6 times 10 to the 19th combinations of pieces of evidence. And it's pretty obvious how that happens. It's the parties who decide what to litigate. Now, that is a real step towards convergence, a thing we talk about a lot. But whatever, you either have to make an ad hoc move to get rid of all these trillions and trillions of possibilities, or embrace something like this that allows the problem to be handled in human time, in real time.
But Ron, my aim, at least at this time, is not to solve all the general problems of the administration of justice all around the world. It is a very narrow scope, that is to suggest the possibility of analyzing logically the reasoning, or one possible reasoning, that the trier of fact may use to make a rational assessment of the evidence and to reach a rationally justified conclusion about the fact. Of course, all what I said, for instance, about the search of truth as a purpose of the may be rejected. One say, no, it's interesting to establish the truth of the facts. Then there are other possibilities. I simply proposed one possibility. For that reason, I specified the premises, my premises that can be rejected for dozens of philosophical or of legal reasons. My choice is a choice of a rational perspective in the consideration of evidence and in the construction, so to say, of a truthful decision about the facts. But I'm fully aware of the existence of dozens of other possibilities. Then, I insist, my purpose is not to solve the universal problems of the administration of justice. Of course, it's a very narrow one. That is to suggest a possibility among various possibilities of having a rational construction of a final decision about the truth of the facts considered as a relative truth, considered truth as correspondence, etc., etc. I know very well, I know rather well how these things are said in the legal and general philosophy in the last 20 or 30 years, from the postmodernist to that. And of course, I can accept other perspectives. Simply, I don't like them. They try to explain, on the one hand, why I don't like them. On the other hand, that rejecting these theories, in my opinion, there is at least one rational idea of the assessment of the evidence and how to reach a relatively truthful decision about the facts. The intent conviction says no, says all the opposite. The moral certainty about I don't know what as well. Therefore, I tried simply to suggest how a rational judge could work about the evidence that has been presented. No more than that. That I said that this is a possibility. I don't exclude that one can use other logical tools in order to deal with. And I not exclude that things may be extremely complicated. But if you look at the chart made by Wigmore 60 years ago, it was very complicated. The reality of evidence may be very complicated. The problem is, how do we deal with? Do we use the intuition, irrational, immediate, holistic, or do we engage in analytical work using controllable kinds of inference every step? Doesn't matter if the steps are 200. The important is the method that is applied to deal even with. One of the limits of the Bayesian recent theory is that in that book in Italy, after 400 pages of analysis, the author says, unfortunately, all this may function only when we have one evidence. And so what? You are dealing with a case that is almost irreal, because the reality of cases is not that we have to work with one item of evidence. So all this is open. If one comes out with a better model of rational analysis of the evidence, welcome. Please tell me how you do it.
Bien, más preguntas.
More questions.
Pregunta ahí. Aquí.
Profesor Taruffo, muchas gracias.
Professor Taruffo, thank you for your presentation. It really summarizes very well your work of so many years. My question has to do with a concern about now and here, because theories, methodologies are done to describe the world and to solve real problems in the world. And in many locations in Latin America, when there's a litigation, well, it depends really on the quality of information that the lawyers give us what will happen. And typically, in my experience, the information is not really complete at all. In my experience in arbitration, for example, of public tender, and when there's problems with private and public organizations, many not sophisticated companies in small countries, well, such as Peru, will submit probative information, but very often it's incomplete information, and sometimes too much of it, too abundant, and they give a whole narrative of the case, but don't really give the proper information, and they don't link anything. They just narrate a kind of story, and they don't link the story with certain elements that are presented at the end as an annex, and then the counterparty does something similar. So from your point of view, Professor, up to what point the person making the decision has to kind of interfere in that, so to speak, to be able to do something about it? Because obviously we're going to be asking the parties to give testimony and what have you, but they're not really kind of giving evidence or items of evidence in a sufficiently good manner to be able to make a decision. So how can the judge do anything about it? I'm saying it because yesterday morning with Professor Zuckerman, for example, it was clear that eventually to do part of the work on evidence of one of the parties by the person making the decision is losing objectiveness, and then you are far from the truth that should give light to a rational analysis of the world. But of course, the person making the decision has to be impartial, objective. So how to handle it rationally, according to your standpoint? Thank you. Yeah, if I understood the question correctly, an important aspect is what must be done and has to be done by the judge in situations like the one you mentioned, because if the parties don't offer an adequate description of the facts and don't offer sufficient evidence, then the decision is simple, burden of proof and so on, etc., right? The other problem is whether, well, if the judge has the power or the duty of directly doing something about this. I mean, they're two different things, really. Because the problem of what the facts are and that the judge has to delve into that is a problem of allegation, and it's a problem of, well, the procedure. But the other aspect is about the probative power. So that would mean to order and organize the items of evidence that the parties have not known how to organize. So from a very rigorous theoretical point of view, my idea of the quest for truth is the very active role of the judge. From the two standpoints, for example, there's an article of the French Civil Code that allows judges to question witnesses about all the facts of the case, and what the judge typically cannot do in other legal systems. So then there are different procedural systems, and the norms and standards vary about what the judge can do. And here we have this ideological conflict between the guarantists and non-guarantists and so on and so forth. So how to solve problems like this one? The way I see it, it depends on these two factors, most especially what the judge can or has to do or must do. An example that I find interesting from this point of view is in the canonical process, where it is said that the judge of the church has the duty of investigating as part of his job on all the relevant facts in the case. And he, as his job dictates, has to organize all the items of evidence that the parties did not submit. So this is in the church. And I mean, the church has this tradition of Inquisition and what have you. We know about that. But here we're talking about civil law, not inquisitorial processes. And then another possibility is this one, of a judge that has the duty, the specific duty, of investigating in the quest for truth and going beyond what has been submitted by the parties. And here the solutions might be very different. But once again, at the basis of it, we have political or ideological solutions more than technical, really. Fine, time for one last question. Yes.
Aquí, tú, levanta la mano que así le identifican. Ahí.
Hands up to see you. Yes.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Ricardo Ojeda.
Good afternoon, I'm Ricardo Ojeda. I come from the city of Mexico. I'm very happy because today I've been able to listen to two of the best experts, Dr. Jordi Ferrer and right now you, in procedural doctrine. But I don't know, there's a contradiction. I don't know how to kind of merge the two presentations, because this morning Dr. Ferrer told us that truth does not exist and that the procedure can't really reach truth, and that no other discipline can reach or establish truth. And when he talked about it, I remembered the Bible in which Pilate asks Jesus, what is truth? And that's the end of the Bible narrative, because not even Jesus Christ could tell Pilate what truth is. But right now, you, at the beginning of your conference, are telling us that there must be a kind of connection between syllogism, the statement, and the normative hypothesis and the consequence. And this premise is truth. But then this morning we were told it doesn't exist. So I perfectly understood the difference between narrative truths of literature, of course, like such as Anna Karenina, different from Virginia Woolf, because I mean, there it is a fact that she also committed suicide by kind of filling up the pockets of her coat with stones, and not so much jumping in front of a train like Anna Karenina. But then I don't understand, and as well as this issue of truth, Dr. Ferrer was talking about some thresholds, and he gave us 6 in his excellent conference. And you, at the end of yours, are talking to us about this specific case in the last 2 minutes of many $1 million or euro, in which there were initial decisions that were kind of modified, and eventually, well, what happened was a lot of money had to be paid. But then, isn't there, how to say, some kind of subjective layer in all this? So how do we look for truth? I mean, this morning we heard not truth, but correspondence of fact. Or then, yes, do we be more subjective, and then, yes, we have to go in this quest for truth, and that should be sufficient. So then up to what point has the judge, can he or she judge fact? If you give me 2 hours, I'll give you an answer. Or at least I could try and say something about the concept of truth, and so on and so forth. But in 2 minutes and few words, correspondence for me, or correspondence with the reality of fact, is the truth criterion. It's the reality of the fact that determines whether the description is true or not. So this is the basic criterion of correspondence. Another problem with Geordi, and in general, we don't talk about absolute truths. They are nowhere to be found in any context, be it judicial or extrajudicial. We talk of relative truths, of probable truths, of coming close to the truth, of a degree of probative confirmation, of a factic premise. I don't see any conflict between what Jordi said talking this morning and what I'm saying right now from this standpoint, because he also talked about truth as a correspondence in his premise, and he also said or talked about a rational standpoint in the assessment of evidence. The only thing is that the problem he was dealing with is different from the one I've been dealing with, but if we understand correctly what we understand when we're talking about truth, well, truth regarding the whole set of probative items that we have. So relative might be at a very low level or very high level or medium level or threshold, if you like. And here we have the problem of standards of proof. But of course, we always talk about quest, looking for something that could be justified in a rational manner, and not just with intuition, be them holistic or analytical intuitions. It's a rational theory of the assessment of evidence, as Jordi wrote in his book about this. And I mean, the other Jordi as well talks about this when he refers to the assessment of evidence. I mean, this is a standpoint where when you have the premises and the statements for analysis, well, things can be complicated, but I mean, there isn't such a great difference. Relative truth, rational assessment of items of evidence, that's what it is. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, now, 20 minutes. Thank you, Dr. Taruffo.